Okay, guys, I'm going to give you a presentation on basically it's like setting within a narrative. So we're going to start with setting itself. Setting involves four parts. So it's the geographical, like the literal place that the events are happening. It's the historical part of things, the social part of things that are going on, and the cultural. And we've talked about those in different ways, I think, with Americana, and a little bit with The Road. I think maybe last year some of the books you talked about it a little bit more. So I put some pictures on here to talk about, like, obviously the top right corner is like geographically, the road's pretty dismal, right? And what I would do is you take notes on this, like add things to give yourself some space between any of the bullet points so that you can write additional things that I'm telling you. So the roads, there's not much. It's dark. It's the buildings are broken. The light poles are broken. I just happened to choose that picture because it was of a road. Historically, we don't know what's happened. We know it's some kind of apocalyptic situation, but other than that, we don't know what's been going on. We do know that it's like, around now, 2020. I think it was written in 2010, and he says 10 years ago at some point in the novel. Socially, we discussed, how they've formed the good guys and the bad guys. Those are social groups as far as setting goes. And then culturally, it's obviously set in America. We don't know if anything's happened anywhere else. We would assume so, probably, because it's not like anyone's come to help them. But culturally, it's a little bit more difficult. We're going through American cultural beliefs as we look at those global issues to evaluate The Road. On the left side is the gate to Auschwitz, where Elie Wiesel, since we all read Night, Elie Wiesel was kept in the concentration camp. So geographically speaking, it's Auschwitz, it's a concentration camp. Historically speaking, Hitler's taken over. He's created and changed the social and cultural aspects of Germany and of Europe, right? So when you look at the social aspects, what are the social groups? How are people divided? So you have the Germans, and you have like the Polish and the Jews and all of the others, the gays and lesbians, the blacks, anyone that Hitler, the disabled, anyone Hitler felt like was not pure enough. Culturally, what you have two things, right? You have like what's happening in the 1930s as this is going, early 40s when this is going on, and you have like the cultural shift that happens afterwards as the world finds out. And so there's two aspects to setting, and Elie alludes to that both at the beginning in the prologue and at the end of the book. Within cultural, you also have their beliefs and values that he talks about and he struggles with, right, when he's questioning God, because that is so inherent in not only his race as a Jew, but also it being his religion. Below that, like if we're going counterclockwise, I suppose, is Hamilton. And if you have not seen Hamilton, I highly recommend you watch it before we get to All My Sons, just because I will reference Hamilton. I'll show you a scene from Hamilton in the White House, and talk about props and setting and such. This scene is from the room where it happened, and you can see Hamilton behind Aaron Burr, watching what's going on. Geographically, we know that it's set in New York City. Parts of it are set in Philadelphia, but most of it's in New York. historically speaking, it's the coming of age for our country. It's building the climax of Burr shooting Hamilton. Socially, you have like separate parties, and you kind of see where the first divisions of the party system begin with within Hamilton. Culturally, I think it's a really unique take on. Lin-Manuel has always said that it was the America of yesterday with the America of today, which is why he's such a mixed races within his actors. But the most important thing, I think, and that's what the asterisk is for, is like each of these things are either significant to character or to theme. So the geographical place has to be important to the character. It has to somehow be important to the theme. The historical background that's happening has to be important to the character. It has to be important to the theme. Otherwise, it wouldn't be mentioned. If it's some, even if it's space and it's 2300 or something, those are still important to whatever the theme is, whether that means that it's timeless or not. Again, social change happens over time, so setting matters. And then cultural shifts as well, especially in our country. And the final picture of the children sitting in the broken building, those are English kids, and that is why Lord of the Flies happened. The British kids that were taken out of England to be safe, Operation Pied Piper. Historically it was World War II. It's also the set for why he wrote Lord of the Flies. That was his inspiration. Socially and culturally, like the effects of war, all of that plays into the plot line. The characters' likes and dislikes and personalities within Lord of the Flies. Okay. Next, place or space. So in anthropology, there's this idea of like movement, space, and time, and how we're all affected by that, whether we're stagnant or we're moving. And so I have a few examples for you on this one, and that hopefully you can reference and understand. So setting place and space creates a context, right? So place is like a literal place you can name. Space is like the character's role within that place, right? So place, most of you have seen at least part of Friends episodes. Central Perk is one of the main settings, besides the apartment complex, of Friends, that does two things, right? Like, so a lot of their physical contact, who they sit next to, that's the space, right? If Ross and Rachel are fighting, they don't sit next to each other, or they're not both within that place, right? Rachel is working, Ross comes in, sees she's working, leaves. Or Ross is in there, Rachel comes in, they're fighting, one of them leaves. So like the character's choice of space or where they're forced to move within a place is important within the context of the text itself. So place and space also affect perception, right? The next one down, Gossip Girl. I don't know how many of you watched that. I had kids like beg me to watch it years ago, so I binged it. They're sitting on the steps, Blair and they're always just sitting on those steps of the Met in New York. And I think this is a great example of why setting matters. Like, you couldn't have Gossip Girl anywhere but New York City. And that kind of money, that kind of place, like, it couldn't be a southern place with money. It has to be like the elite part of New York City, where you think like the people that have older money and have been in high society for a really long time. It's so important to the context of that show. Setting itself can be a character, and I think that's important to remember too. In some ways, I think that it can build suspense, right? It has a character of its own. I mean, setting as it's described is often described like a character, you know, what it's wearing per se, so what it's like outside, what the trees look like, what the buildings look like, what the inside looks like, and all of that sets some kind of tone, right? Just like a character does. Sometimes we're barely aware of it, but normally setting is super important. And like I said, it sets a tone and often foreshadows other things that are going to happen. The final one is in the bottom. That's when Tony Stark and Peter Parker meet. And the humble abode of Peter Parker is important to the context of that series, right? Like, Peter Parker has to be a kid. He has to live simply, and it directly juxtaposes everything that Tony Stark has in his home. And it's important for Tony to go and see that, as opposed to him calling Peter Parker to his home where he doesn't get perspective. Tony Stark gets perspective because he goes and he sees, like, where Peter Parker lives and his aunt and, you know, the kind of life he has. Okay, the other part of setting is time. I found this quote when I was, you know, making sure I was covering everything for this topic. Narrative gives us the shape of time, right? So sometimes we're tricked by time, and I've put 3 examples on here. If you haven't seen the movie In Time with Justin Timberlake, it's pretty good. Basically, you can see on his arm that it's kind of lit up and glowing. This is a world where you know when you're gonna die. Like, your time is on your arm, and it ticks down every single second, which, like, kind of probably would give me anxiety in real life. But the things you do, right, that hurt you make your time go faster, right? Or you can do things to kind of slow down your time, and you can buy time from other people, and it's like this whole kind of dystopian, messed up world. So if you haven't seen that movie and you get a chance, it's pretty good. So that's a very literal, like, countdown within a movie, moving through time, right? But you have movies like Beaches at the Bottom. Again, if you haven't seen it, great flick. Great, one of the best friendship flicks ever. Where you start with a flashback, actually. And so this is where we're going to talk about flashback a little bit. You start with a flashback, and then move forward through time, you know, and occasionally going back and forth as memories within a relationship. Me, Earl and the Dying Girl, one of my favorite movies ever. On my top 5 list for sure. It starts at the end and then moves you back through the story. So all of these choices with structure, because essentially that's what time does, right? It structures the text. You can speed it up, you can slow it down, go backwards, just like with the examples I've given you. And I think what's important, and this was another line that I saw in one of the IB books I was looking at, basically a writer can get a man to a plane in 2 sentences or in 40 sentences. It all depends on, like, what the importance of time is in that scene. And different times can happen simultaneously, right? Like, if one person's having a memory, what's currently happening is still currently happening, and I think that's important. To when are the flashbacks being written into the story, and why are they important in that certain moment? Okay, so Time Continued. These are 2 movies that really jack with time, or 2 stories. The Curious Case of Benjamin Button is actually by F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby. It's a short story. I think it's like maybe 30 pages long. I used to do it with my junior honors kids when I taught it. Basically, if you haven't seen this, Brad Pitt's obviously in the movie. He's born as an old man, and he goes backwards through, like, his life. So, like, literally when he's born, he looks like an old man. And then he looks younger and younger, so when everyone else is aging, he's getting younger. It's an interesting story. So it, like, totally jacks with what our timeline normally is. And most stories, obviously, are chronological. The disrupted and the disjointed, though, I think lend themselves to like complex stories. They often have a lot of secondary subplots. But I think one of the things that's super important to remember is like with flashbacks is what is this trying to inform us about? Is it informing us about the character? Is it informing us about the plot line? Is it trying to create suspense? Etc. Within Americana, I want you to think about like blog placement. Does she describe the blog first and then give you the blog, or does she just give you the blog and then describe it? And why would either one of those directions be important? Okay, passage of time. So the passage of time is important because it develops the characters, it creates the plot, it spins through different settings, it reveals the theme, and it structures the text. And one of the, a great example of this is from Ratatouille. I'm sure most of you have seen it. If not, you've got a lot of movies to watch over break, I guess. And I'm going to go ahead and play this so you can see it's a pretty short clip.
They must be joking.
Okay, so when you look at that scene from Ratatouille, right, like the guy wanted to basically shut down the critic, didn't think he was going to get anything that compared to what his mother's dish was. It did compare to his mother's dish to the point where he didn't even care about the review, right? He drops his pen. So a flashback in this scenario causes like an entire change of events. And I think that that's important too. When you look at some of the flashbacks in Americana, do they change events moving forward? And I think that's something we don't always think about is, does a flashback change an event? And that's something we could have looked at, I think, in The Road as well. The flashbacks that the man has, do they change the course of events moving forward? So something to think about moving as we move ahead. Okay, other structural features. There are a couple things I want you to think about too. Catharsis. I didn't really talk about this last year with Oedipus, and I know a lot of you didn't read it, but catharsis is like the emotional release through artistic effects. And a lot of times that happens with flashback, right? That the main character or the character having a flashback is releasing like these emotions in some way, because otherwise why would you have this memory? The other thing that I think is really important with flashback and that is an effect of it is dramatic irony. And I hate mentioning the reader in anything, but I do think that flashback has the purpose of informing the reader for future scenes, like so they know something that the other characters don't know. It is an insight in some way, creating dramatic irony. And the final structural feature I want to talk about that we haven't really talked about much at all are punctuation and style choices. So we really focused on that with The Road, but we haven't with Americana. And as we move forward, these last few assignments that I have you analyze or things that I have you look at, I want you to look at her style choices, Adici's, and you know, the Road is very, very different stylistically than anything probably you've ever read. But Adichie is her diction spot on most of the time. Minimally that. But I think that even if you start looking at her sentence structure, right? Like when does she use short sentences? When does she use long and complex sentences? Is there a pattern? Does she change that for the blogs? Like all of those things I think are going to be important as you start evaluating like her actual language as we finish up this book.